So now we have seen the first way to create a thread in Java. There's another way that is pretty close to the same thing. It does basically the same thing, but it does it in a different way. The way that we did this example is, if you remember, with our continuous pointer, we had inherited from thread. We extended thread, and there's a couple of problems with this approach. The first one is that you can't inherit from anything else. So you are kind of limited here. You have to extend thread. And the second one is it's not very dynamic. It is not very reusable. If we use an interface instead, we can pass that interface around and we can write other methods and things that operate against that interface. So a little bit easier to use and more flexible solution. So that is what we are going to do for this next example, as we are going to switch this over to use an interface called Runnable. And this is the key to concurrency in Java, is this Runnable interface. There is a lot of things that operate on a Runnable interface and can do something with a Runnable interface, but we are just going to show this simple example first here. And what we are going to do here is, instead of extending thread, we are going to implement Runnable. So I will change this to implement Runnable. And then you can see that it is still going to have this same run method. The only thing is we are not going to call this super run. Instead, we are just going to call run. And really, this class hasn't had to change very much at all. Now we are just implementing this Runnable interface. And this Runnable interface has a run method that you have to implement. That is the only method you have to implement. And since we have implemented that method, we are pretty much good to go from this perspective. Now we do need to go into our main program, and we can't start it up the same way, but we can't just call start on here because it doesn't have a start method. It has a run method. But what we can do is we can take our continuous pointer and we can create a thread, and then we can pass this into the thread. So if I create a thread called thread, and then if I set it to or equal to new thread, in the constructor for thread, you notice you can pass in a Runnable. So if I pass in a new continuous pointer or pass in this continuous pointer that we created, then I have constructed a thread that is using this Runnable implementation. And now I can call thread.start, and this will start this thread. So thread actually ends up being a wrapper to a Runnable. Whatever you pass into a thread, that implements a Runnable interface. When you start that thread, it will start. So let's go ahead and run this, and we should pretty much get the same result that we had gotten before. So I'll run this. And now if we look at this console output, you can see here that the threads are interleaved. So this is another way of doing basically the same thing. The only difference here really is that you are using an interface instead of inheritance. And if you remember the modules that we had talked about using inheritance and why it is better to use aggregation, this is one of those reasons, as we will see a little bit later when we use an executor, that it is going to use a Runnable interface, and we have left our possibility for our continuous pointer to inherit. It can still extend a class. So that is the basic solution, and I would recommend, if you are creating threads, that you default to this implementing Runnable interface. It is just real simple. Just create your class, implement Runnable, override the run method, and you are basically done.